Bonjour! Hello there, I am that Gamer Guy and this is Gamer Guy Travels. As promised, this is going to be a new series about all things travel related, but I'm going to start the series off with a sub-series of videos, basically giving my first impressions / review of each country that I went to during my Euro trip. Unlike the majority of my usual videos, I haven't written down notes on what I want to say, and I'm going to continue to do that for this sub-series, just so the memories are more vivid and in the moment. Instead, I'm going to watch my Euro trip playlist off camera and just recall whatever comes to mind. So you don't have to have seen my Eurotrip playlist to understand this, but it might put it in some context. I'll leave a link somewhere. So our first stop on this journey, if you couldn't tell by my awful French accent, is France. More specifically, Paris. I didn't get the chance to see as much of France as I would like to have done, but I feel like Paris is a pretty good starting point. Now, I've heard that a lot of French people don't like Parisians. I'm assuming in the same way that a lot of British people don't like Londoners. There is a seeming stigma attached to big city folk, that they are rude or impatient or whatever. As someone that lived in London for 3 years, I can dispute that, so I'm sure many Parisians would dispute that as well. For me personally, I didn't find Parisians to be rude at all, but obviously I speak very little French. But also, and this applies to every video in this series, when you're travelling, it's really hard to judge a city's people, because you're essentially only interacting with other travellers and people whose job it is to interact with travellers. Be that people that work in hostels, tourist attractions, or restaurants and bars. So whilst I say I found Parisians to be nice, you really can't give an informed opinion unless you live there. So on to Paris itself. Paris was the first city on my Euro trip. Paris was also the city that I was probably most excited to go to. You see films set in Paris and it just looks so romantic and so high culture.
Paris.
Paris.
Paris?
But I was also wary of Paris. I was aware that I was a potential victim for Paris syndrome. If you don't know what Paris syndrome is, it's basically a depressive mental disorder that tourists, apparently usually Japanese tourists, suffer when visiting Paris because they're disappointed. Luckily, that wasn't the case for me. I loved Paris. Paris was the first stop on my trip, which meant it was the first time I'd been abroad by myself. So I was understandably nervous but more excited. I arrive at Gare du Nord, one of the main train stations, and one of the first things I realise is how quickly all French that I know evaporates from my mind. Up until that point I had been learning French for about a year, albeit on and off, and literally I must have been on French ground for less than 3 minutes when someone asked me something in French. And instead of just saying "Désolé, je ne comprends pas," my instant reaction was, English. And that was it. From that moment on, I made very little attempt to speak French. I know that makes me sound like an awful first language speaker. I apologise. But even when I did muster the courage and attempt to speak French, they could just hear my obvious English accent and would start speaking English anyway. So where were we? I arrived at the station and I need to get to my hostel, which means I have to take the metro. So I could probably make a separate video just talking about the metro. As I said, I used to live in London. I know the tube very well. In theory, the tube and the metro shouldn't be too different. And for the most part, they're not. The metro is easy to navigate regardless of whether you speak French or not. I'm not a fan of the ticket system, whereas in London you'd either have a contactless Oyster card or you'd buy one all-day underground ticket. Paris seems to have individual tickets that can only be used once. Also, whereas most of the newer metro lines have automatic doors, or at least doors that you push a button to open, some of the older lines have this weird lever thing that you have to crank to open the door. And with those, for the most part, I just waited for someone that was getting off on the same stop as me to open the door. That wasn't until the moment that I had to get off and no one else was. Frantically tried to turn the lever the wrong way, upon when a French woman took pity on me and opened it for me. So the metro itself is more or less the same. The people that use the metro are not. Some of the things I saw using the Paris metro, I will never forget. The first thing that jumps to mind is the abundance of amputees. There were so many, I'm assuming homeless amputees, set up across the metro. I found it to be so bizarre. I also saw a lot of, I think, Syrian refugees. Homelessness is obviously an issue in Paris, but the main thing I remember about the metro is the entertainment. Now, I'm not referring to people at the actual stations, I'm referring to people on the carriages. In London you'd see buskers on the carriages maybe 2 or 3 times a month. In Paris it was like 2 or 3 times a day. And the entertainment itself was definitely of varying quality. Anything from 2 guys with a complete DJ set to a very drunk man with a tambourine. And the worst thing about it is you're trapped. At least at the station you can walk past them and if they're good, you can tip them. With these guys, you're with them until you reach your stop, which is why nobody tips them, so I don't understand why it's a thing. But enough about the metro. I get to my hostel, the first hostel I've ever stayed at. Luckily it was great, met loads of great people, and my stay in Paris had officially begun. So as Paris was the first stop on my trip, it was also probably the only city that I'd extensively planned. I'd pre-booked everything that I wanted to do, and oh my god am I thankful that I did that. I was in Paris mid-March, so not peak season at all, and the queues more or less for every tourist attraction were long. Luckily I'd bought a Paris Museum pass, which I can't recommend enough, that essentially acts as a fast pass, but if I had just arrived on the day I would have been waiting for a long time. And I don't want to think what the queues are like during peak season. So I went to a lot of museums and monuments and attractions. I won't go through them all, but some highlights. First highlight is Notre Dame. Travelling across Europe, you see a lot of churches. And after a while you start to kind of get church fatigue. And it didn't help that the first church I visited was Notre Dame. Everything you hope to see in a Catholic church, you'll find in Notre Dame. You can even go up to the top and pretend to be Quasimodo. As a non-religious and LGBT person, I did at first find it hard to appreciate, but I quickly learned to separate the religious rhetoric from the architecture and the emotion of the place. Second highlight is the Louvre. Similarly, the Louvre is probably my favourite museum that I went to. I am by no means an art connoisseur, but I was there for a good 6 hours and I still feel like I've only seen this much of it. And also, the Louvre is a world famous museum, probably the most famous art gallery in the world, and they let you take pictures. We'll come back to that point in future videos. And third highlight is of course the Eiffel Tower. It is cliche, but there's a reason for that. During the day I went to Trocadero to see the Eiffel Tower from afar, which is the spot with the highest concentration of selfies that I saw for my entire Euro trip. And at night I went up the tower itself. Now, I wouldn't say I have a phobia of heights, but I definitely don't like heights. And what better way to face your fear than going up one of the most famous landmarks in the world. So yes, it might be cliche, and yes, a little expensive, but that view was priceless. So now let's talk about one of my favourite aspects of travelling, food. For each country that I went to, I basically wrote a list of national dishes that I wanted to try. And during travelling, with regards to food, you quickly realise that there is always one dish that is sold everywhere. With France, or at least Paris, it's crepes. Crepes, So because they're sold literally everywhere, it's kind of hard to find one that's authentic and not just a tourist version of the dish. So I'm ashamed to say I only had one crepe in Paris, but it was pretty good. My main ventures were frog's legs and snails. Stereotyping to the max. Frog's legs turns out isn't as common as I thought it would be. They're seemingly only sold in specialist restaurants, so unfortunately I didn't get to try them, but there's always next time. But I did get to try snails, and they were delicious. And finally, just some random things that I noticed in Paris. Whilst Paris is nice to look at, smell not so much. In some places it smells pretty bad. Street vendors, artists and performers. You see a lot of the same things throughout the city. Lots of people selling LED spring things that launch into the sky. Lots of dogs made out of sand. And lots of levitating Yodas. Sadly, I didn't see a single French robot though. And Asian tourists. Now, I am not one for stereotyping at all. Can you feel the butt coming? But Asian tourists, or more specifically, groups of Asian tourists, have no spatial awareness. If you are in their pathway, you will be trampled. But the main thing I noticed about Paris, and this is probably going to sound quite naive, is just how similar it is to London. Being my first ever city alone, I didn't really know what I'd make of it. And a small part of me envisioned this alien world where everything I know is different. But it really is just a French-speaking London. And that for me is not a bad thing. And I can honestly say that I see myself living there at some point. So I think I'll stop there. Those are my first impressions of Paris. Thank you for watching. If you've been to Paris, please leave your first impressions down in the comments. And if there's anywhere else in France that you think I should visit, then please let me know. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more. If there's anything travel related you'd like me to discuss in a future video, then please leave your suggestions down in the comments. J'espère te voir la prochaine fois, mais en attendant...